Appreciate you coming. Appreciate you participating in the class, and any kind of question or comment you've got is welcome. As we continue our study in the book of Exodus, we started in the context last week. Okay, is this going to work? Maybe it's not charged enough. Hold on a second. Oh, there it went. We'll see if it continues. Otherwise, I've got another control I can use here. And we know the children of Israel have come down into Egypt. They've been there for a few hundred years, let's say. We'll nail that down later on, or we'll try to nail that down later on when we get to the time when they actually leave. But they've been here for quite a while. The first Pharaoh was a wonderful guy. He was wise. He let Joseph be in charge, and everything went well through the time of plenty and the time of famine. If you remember that study in the book of Genesis. But now, chapter 1, verse 8, there's just a little teeny bit of review here. There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh's supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. Isn't God amazing? You know, he doesn't go by affliction in life is not necessarily something that's going to bring us down. Here, the affliction that they went through, God made sure that it caused them to increase. But and the next verse, and they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, so rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. So very difficult, hard, abased them and abused them severely. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. So here's not working to subdue them and to put them in bondage and to have them have rigorous work to do. That was still increasing. So here's the king of Egypt now, the Pharaoh, has a new plan. He spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, "When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, then you shall live." Interesting enough, we talked about that momentarily last week. Of course, that's going to reduce their number, but Lee Eccles mentioned to me, that reduces their fighting force too. You kill the man child, you're not going to have as many soldiers to rise up, and subdue you. So he mentioned that to me after class last week. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive?" Well, this is what they tell him. The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them." And we talked about, every time. Every time they're that tough. We're talking about a few 100,000 women here. So this is a deception. I believe it is. It doesn't come out and say it is, but I think they were deceiving Pharaoh. And this was the excuse they gave, which could be partly true. Kind of like Abraham's wife was also his sister. So he told the Pharaoh and Abimelech he was his sister. Well, he didn't tell him all the truth. So there's a deception here. But look what happens in verse 20. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. Okay, let's stop there for a minute, or not more than a minute actually, and look at this for a bit. Because I asked the question last week, is it in this extreme situation acceptable to God for the midwives to lie to Pharaoh, to deceive him, to save these babies? So that's the question we want to look at for a bit. And I told you last week, and I'll tell you this week, I don't know the answer for sure. This is something that's bothered me for a long time. Or I wondered about it. It hasn't bothered me. I haven't stayed awake at night. But I wondered about it a long time. We know how much God is about the truth, and there's no lie in him. And we'll read some scriptures in a little bit about how that's the way he wants our lives to be. But we do want to understand something else as we look at this, as that in a lot of God's commands, in exceptional situations, there are exceptions. It could be the case with this one. Let's look a few of those commands and see that there are exceptions to some of them that we can understand pretty clearly. In fact, Jesus basically rebuked the Pharisees for not understanding some of these exceptions to some of the principles and laws that are contained in the Old Testament. Let's start with this one. Obey the government. Okay, are we to obey the government? We are. You may not like it, but that's the way it is. And let's read one of the passages here. And we're going to be pretty brief on these, but here's an example. We're looking to see, okay, here's going to be a command of God. Are there ever any exceptions to it? Well, we read in Romans 14, beginning verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. There you go. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So, should you obey the government? Yes. This is something God has set in order. Okay, is there ever an exception to this? Yes, there is. In fact, we read of one in Acts chapter 5. Here the Apostle Peter and the apostles are teaching and preaching in the name of Jesus, and they're taken into custody by the Jews, by the leaders, by the Pharisees, and told not to preach anymore because they're bringing a lot of difficulty on their heads, on the leaders' heads. So in verse 27 of chapter 5 of Acts, and when they had brought them, they set them before the council. This is, I think, Peter and the apostles. And the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us, preaching about Jesus. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So there's an exception to this principle in Romans 13, that we're to obey the government. Yes, there is an exception. This is one of them. Whenever you're commanded by our government to do something that is against the will of God, obey God, right? Okay, again, we're just laying down a little bit of a background here that sometimes some of God's commands have exceptions. I'm not saying for sure there is one to the principle about you should not lie, but I'm just saying there are some exceptions. I always like to lay a background to make a case here. Okay, we just made that point. Okay, another command, no work on the Sabbath. Now this is an Old Testament command. It doesn't apply to Christians today for various reasons, but let's look and see if we were a Jew back in the Old Testament. Here's what we would read about the seventh day, the Sabbath day, and what we should do. Exodus 20 verse 8 beginning, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle. The animals can't even work. Nor your stranger, even people coming in who aren't Jews, they're not to work. Who's within your gates? So, Sabbath day, keep it holy. Don't work on the Sabbath day. Are there any exceptions to this command? Okay, and Jesus really told the Jews that he expected them to understand this, that there would be exceptions. So let's look at a few of those. Here's Matthew chapter 12, verse 1 through 4. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. They're out there harvesting and taking they should have had this before, whatever the argument was. They're working on the Sabbath. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? Looking back to a principle in the Old Testament when King David was in a place where when they were hungry and there was no food for them to eat. Have you not read about David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. David essentially broke a law. The point is was this a proper exception? Well, of course it was, because here Jesus says, this is why we can do what we're doing. There's an example about keeping the Sabbath, that it's not at all an exclusive command. It's a principle that we want. You don't work on the Sabbath day, but there's an exception. In extreme situations, there's an exception to obeying the Sabbath. Let's continue on in the context here, verse 5. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Priests on the Sabbath day worked and made sacrifices. Well, that essentially, he's saying, it breaks the Sabbath. They're working. Well, there was an exception here. The priests could offer sacrifices on the Sabbath. Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. He's talking about himself. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. That's a quote from, let me catch up to where I am here. Not Malachi. Okay, Bill, where's your notes? You got to look at your notes once in a while. Where did I put that down? Where's that a quote from? Hosea. Hosea 6, verse 6. Go back and see the context there. We're not going to spend the time to do that. But he's laying down a principle here. It was laid down before. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Oh, so you're never supposed to obey the law? No, you're supposed to obey the law. But sometimes there's an exception. And God leads toward the mercy part. Did he want David to die there back when he was taking that bread from the showbread? No, he didn't want. There was some mercy there. Here, these people, Jesus and his disciples, as they plucked the corn, they were very hungry. There's no other source of food. Otherwise, they would have had it, taken it. Now, that doesn't mean if you're walking on the way home from work and your tummy starts growling, if you were a Jew back at that time, that you can go ahead and start plucking corn. No, it's got to be extreme. I think the circumstances that are described here are extreme circumstances. And when it's extreme, then sometimes there's an exception. Don has his hand up. Who's got the mic?
And of course, in the law, there is the permission to glean the fields of somebody's, as long as you don't store it, you can glean it and eat it, which is what they were doing. So they weren't really breaking any law anyway.
Well, but I think when you glean the fields, you shouldn't do it on the Sabbath normally.
No, okay. But
right.
But anyway, what I was going to say is in John, Jesus points out that the Pharisee or the priests circumcise a child on the eighth day, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Even if it's on a Sabbath,
right.
They will do that to not break that law, right?
Yeah.
So what Jesus
So here you've got
saying,
two principles. One kind of seems like it contradicts the other. Well, you go with what this says. You go with the merciful route. Mm-hmm. I don't know what mercy would be in that case.
Anyway, and in that context, in John, Jesus was essentially saying, I heal when it is necessary to heal.
We'll get there next.
Even if it's on the Sabbath day.
Right.
I will heal.
And we'll see that in the next part here. Mm-hmm. So Bill's got a comment up there, in the back there. He had his hand up, now he's got it down. I never know with Bill. It goes up, it goes down.
Well, Don sort of stole my thunder there at the end.
Oh.
Jesus healed on the Sabbath.
Okay, let's wait on that. Very next verses, in fact. Very next verses. Okay, all right. Mike, you were... Mike? Oh, Gary, Mike up here at the front.
I get my steps in on Sunday.
That's right, you do.
So in John 7, where Jesus is pointing out that two laws conflicted, mm-hmm. and so he said the priests break the Sabbath to perform the circumcision, I see it as a priority. I mean, the circumcision's way higher priority. It had to do with covenant with God, and if you weren't in Genesis 15, if you weren't circumcised, you're cut off. And I mean, it was huge. It was covenant with God. Where the Sabbath, Jesus said in another place, maybe you're going to go there, he says, man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for the man. So Jesus is saying the Sabbath's important, but not nearly as important as circumcision is how I see that John 7.
Sure, and that's a good explanation. I think a great explanation. Again, the principle is some of the commands of God that he makes very plainly. There are exceptions. And Jesus really expected them to understand that. And you'll see, let's go to the next, let's get more comments here. Let's go to the next, in verse 9. Now, when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not he lay hold of it and lift it out? And all of them would say, well, of course, yeah, we do that. We're not going to leave the sheep in there, maybe to get hurt, infected, or die. How much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. So, again, he expected them to understand, you know this. You'd rescue your sheep out of the ditch. So I can't rescue a man from this terrible disease? Sure. He's not saying here the Sabbath doesn't matter. He said there's an exception to this command. Again, I don't know for sure if there's an exception to not deceive people or lie, but we're going to look at a few examples that maybe there is, and you can instruct me for sure to know which way. Mike, you had your hand up?
Yeah. In 1 Samuel 15, there in verse 22, the prophet Samuel raises an intriguing question. He says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Mm-hmm. So there's this question that's raised in what does God delight in? Now, the burnt offerings and sacrifices were actually kind of a remedial obedience because they'd sinned and they needed to offer these sacrifices. But God would be even more pleased, or he would be delighted if people would obey his will. Now, I realize that kind of flies in the face of what we're saying here, but in the same way, if we are working according to his purposes, which sometimes seems to conflict with specific commandments that he's given. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, remember this passage. I can't remember it. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's something that applies at times. Does it apply with these ladies here back at the time of Moses? Actually, Moses is not here yet. Back at the time of Egypt, does it apply to them? Well, we'll see if we think it does, or if I think it does. And well, again, I told you I don't know. So the third example I'm going to give is God hates divorce. Very clear to see this. Matthew 19:3-6, the Pharisees also came to him testing him. Boy, they were testing him all the time. And saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Let not man separate. Okay. And if we go to the verse that basically says in Malachi 2:16, for I hate divorce, says the Lord. That's the reason. He hates it. For a lot of reasons, he hates it. Is there ever an exception to this? Well, in the next few verses in Matthew 19, we'll see Jesus says there is. Where he says in verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery. So being sexually unfaithful to your spouse is a reason, he says here, that's an exception to the whole big principle about your marriage. God hates divorce, stay together, stay married. If this happens, this thing over here, then you have permission. There's an exception, you can divorce. Okay. So there's some examples there. And just a few. We could name others, but that just lined up about, oh yeah, Gary?
So if you want to say, we'll move on and we'll talk about this on another date, feel free. Just, you raised a flag in my head. A few minutes ago, you talked about the exception of when the disciples were gleaning the wheat, and you said it better be a very extreme example of there's no other way, I'm going to die if I don't eat something right now.
Oh, close to it, yeah.
I could see myself trying to explain this to my worldly friends,
Yeah.
and I can hear it before I even say it. Well, what if I'm going to die? Is it okay for me to go steal food from a grocery store? Is it okay for me to go rob someone's house?
Yeah, I don't think so. There's some
Exactly.
Verses, there are some verses that mention that, but I'm not going to go into those. So, but yeah, I would say no, don't steal. To survive, yeah, let's just not go there, okay? For now, but that's a tough question too. Maybe, but I die on the side of the road or take something that wasn't mine to eat? I don't know. Does that mean I'm going to live a life of crime and that's how I'm going to make my living, is stealing people's things? No. Okay, I don't know. You may throw me out of this class as a teacher after we're done here. Okay, God hates lies. This is so clear. He hates this. Clearly, we're going to go now to the subject that we're actually dealing with these ladies here. 6 things the Lord hates here in Proverbs 6, verse 16. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that that devises wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among the brethren, or among brethren. Pretty clear what God thinks about lies. Proverbs 12:22, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. Okay, we're trying to apply this to the circumstance back here. And maybe there's never, ever an exception for deception. Proverbs 19:5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. Pretty clear? You're going to go out and lie tomorrow to get an advantage for yourself? No, we're not going to do that. But is there an exception sometimes for deceiving? And I didn't come up with the exception for deception. I know it rhymes. That's not my fault. It's just the way it is. Wartime in the Old Testament seemed to be, thou shalt not kill. God commanded them to go and kill all these people. There's an exception there. Stealing, thou shalt not steal. He had them take their possessions after he defeated them. Well, they weren't their things. But that was a plundering allowed by God. Even that, you could see a little bit, there's exception in extreme situations like war. And here's a case of that very thing. And back in 2 Samuel 17, verse 14. The setting is King David has been kicked out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, who's taken over. And God is still with David. He's the king. But Absalom rises up and forces David. He flees with all his men. And what David does is he sends back his advisor Hushai, who says he's basically loyal to Absalom, and he wasn't, to deceive Absalom, to tell him, look, I know Ahithophel, this other guy who was very wise, counselor to David, but now he's obeys Absalom, he gives him the right advice. Go now and chase him and you'll defeat him. That's what he told him, and that was the right advice. But Hushai says, no, wait a few days, gather your strength, bring in your forces, and then go after him. Okay, so let's look and see what happens here in verse 14. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai, the Archite, is better than the advice of Ahithophel, even when it wasn't. For the Lord has a purpose. Oh, what the Lord has a purpose in this. That's interesting. Not just David. The Lord has purpose to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. And that's what happens. Because in a few days, Absalom does take his forces, chases after David. David defeats him. David and his mighty men defeat him, and Absalom is killed. And that brings about God's will. Now, question is, was the deception sending in this guy to deceive Absalom to thinking that he should wait a few days, was that something God wanted? You tell me. Now, this much I know. David is the one who sent him in. It doesn't say God did. It said God wanted the result. It doesn't necessarily say he wanted the method. Maybe there should have been a different method, but he wanted the result. And of course, that's the same question we're asking about these ladies back in Exodus. God praised the result of these handmaidens rescuing these babies. Did he agree with the method? That's what we're trying to say. I can't say for sure in 2 Samuel 17, verse 14. I lean toward the fact that, yes, God wanted David to deceive Absalom. It's a time of war. It's an exceptional situation. This wasn't a daily activity, him going to a court and being honest or dishonest or lying to a neighbor just so he can get it. It wasn't that. This was life and death, nation-bending stuff. So, Mike, you had a hand up?
Yeah, I was thinking of the example of how that Abraham, or I think he was Abram at the time, lied to Abimelech about his wife/sister, Sarah. And we see there that in that instance, since Abimelech himself acted innocently, God intervenes and reveals that this is as it is, and brings about the restitution of Sarah to Abram. Mm-hmm. In the case of the midwives, we see the act of an evil man, Pharaoh, who is purposing to perpetrate this evil through these women who fear God.
Right.
And there's two motives that we see on their part. You know, obviously there's a motive to evade the punishment they would receive by disobeying. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But the reason that they wanted to evade that punishment was so that they could further the purpose of God,
because they feared
in
God,
preserving the lives of the babies. So there's not an absolute either way. I mean, we have a man who's intent on an evil purpose, and we have those who respond in what some might consider to be an improper way, but yet it's in order to accomplish the purpose of God.
Right.
I think in the same instance, not the same instance, but
if you were there, would you do the same? That's the question we're asking.
I would.
That's the practical question. If you were them, what would you do?
And
again, I don't know for sure. I have the exact, because we read those verses about how God hates lies, but is this one of those exceptions, an extreme situation? Let me go on a little bit further here.
Well, one other thing I was going to say is, these midwives were also dealing with the Hebrews. So if you show up and you help this this Hebrew woman deliver a baby, and it's a boy, and you kill it, how do you think the Hebrews are going to react?
Yeah, that's
I
not,
mean,
not really mentioned here, but that's,
well, I mean,
yeah.
it would be a difficult situation,
Oh, yeah.
especially after a number of times, and then they go, wait a minute, you were having a boy, you had a boy, you had a boy, and they all died.
That could be a motive, but it's not a motive that's mentioned here. No. So we'll stick with that. Let me go on to this next passage here, and then we'll again. I don't want to. If you got some more, okay, Florento. Sorry, go ahead.
The
back up.
the midwives were blessed because they have saved a lot of innocent lives, and also for not violating the higher law of God, and that is that He forbids the slaughter of innocent children at the time. My question is really, at this very moment, at that time, when we talk about the midwives, that time, there is no law.
There is no Mosaical law.
Yes, there is no law.
That does not mean that there was not a law that God expected them to follow. It's not necessarily written or preserved, but we're going to see in a bit. We have priests back at that time offering sacrifice. Melchizedek was one. We're going to even see that Moses' father-in-law is a priest, probably one acceptable to God, and they would offer sacrifices. So I think there was some kind of standard, even though we don't know what it was, that they were to follow. And certainly preserving the lives of these babies would have been consistent with that.
I think during that time when there was no law,
Really? Anything goes? No?
the exceptions that was mentioned, and how God blessed the midwives even if they have committed the sin. I think it's telling us that that God is sovereign, that He is in control of anything.
Well, there's a thought. Maybe there is no standard of morality here. I think there was, but Mike has a comment. We're not going to get through this today, I don't think. It's okay. I love this discussion. It's great.
So you said the bottom line is, what would we do? And yeah, I'm a flawed man, so it's, I'd be tempted, we all be tempted to lie, but more than that, there's a couple, and I don't have the answer, but I'll say this. Did God need their help to save these babies? Could He have saved them some other way? And so I think maybe so. And were they Egyptian or, kind of along Florento's thinking, were they Egyptian or Hebrew? I think there's a debate on that, but
Yeah, I think they were Hebrew, but that's a debate.
okay. It's just a hard call because I don't think God needed their help, but I think why He treated them well, just like He did Rahab, who you didn't mention yet, but she lied as well, is because of their faith. Yeah,
we'll go there.
It said they feared God, so it's a tough call, and
Yeah, and again, I
don't have the answer either.
I'm trying to be a heretic and say this, you should go out and lie. Not at all. But I want to be honest about our Bible study and look and see if there really is possible an exception here. Let me go to the next passage here, and then we mentioned this Rahab, and we want to look at that too. Judges 7:22. Okay, this is the case of Gideon. Gideon is one of the judges of God that He sent to deliver God's people. This is later on in history. And in this particular context, we've got Gideon defeating the Midianites. Midianites were camped in the valley next to where Gideon was, and they were as numerous as the sand of the sea, it says, in the context back here in Judges 7. And so Gideon brings up the Israelites to battle these people, and they're just innumerable. And God says, there's too many of you. I want you to send this particular many home. And then, that's still too many. I want you to send until there was 300 Israelites to go up against this huge host. And so God sends Gideon in with those 300 people, with trumpets and with pots, that when they came, well, let's see here. It says in verse 22, When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. And the army fled to Beth-Achaia toward Zerah as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabath, whatever. Here's the thing. I believe it is anyway. This was a deception. They didn't have as many men as it sounded like they had, with the trumpets blaring and breaking the pots. Before this battle, they didn't stand up and say, hey, Midianites, 300 guys, that's all we got. No, they went in there pretending to be a great host and deceived the Midianites. And God turned them upon each other, and they fled. And of course, they went after them and killed, I don't remember how many. Wartime, battle, is deception allowable at this time? Do you have to tell the enemy where you are? Or can you sneak up on them? I think this was acceptable. I don't know if it proves it's okay to deceive, but certainly,
Bill?
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, and part of the context of that story too, if we read before what we're reading here, the Midianites were ruthless, and they would descend upon the Israelites at harvest time and then, plunder them for their harvest. And so the Israelites were being starved because they were being robbed of the harvest that they'd planted. So it's not like a situation where we're looking at, Midianite versus Israelite. They're having an even-handed transaction, and the Israelite says it's actually 3 bushels of grain as opposed to it's only 1.5. The Midianites were thieving, lawless kind of people at that time, and that's who they opposed. So we have to, in that case also, to some extent, not that we become the world, but sometimes we have to deal with the world like the world deals with it.
Yeah, well, and that's what's tough. That's what we're trying to figure out here. In almost all the cases you deal with the world, you shall not lie. Now, I don't know. In these cases, there are exceptions. They're very extreme. Maybe there's an exception here at this wartime. Maybe he didn't have to let them know how many people he was. And the next one we're going to get to, we may hold off on, because it's going to take a minute to go over Rahab the harlot and how she rescued the spies that were sent from into Jericho. Scott, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to bring this example up, but I mean, in Isaiah 49, it prophesies of Jesus. It begins to do that, of the servant. And it says in Isaiah 49:2, it says, he has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he has concealed me. Speaking of Jesus, right? God has concealed Jesus. He's hidden Jesus. And it says, and he has also made me a select arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver. Jesus was God's secret weapon, wasn't he? If God were to say to the devil, here's exactly what I'm going to do, I'm going to do all these things, and he kind of did in a way, but it wouldn't have taken much for the devil to break one of those prophecies. I mean, he could have had the soldier break the legs of Jesus, for example, right? You look, this guy's breaking the leg of the 2 thieves. I still don't understand why that didn't happen. Why didn't that guy break Jesus' legs too? Why did they run a spear up into him, Sure, but why not? Why didn't they just break his legs too? I mean, if I was somebody who's going through the execution, I mean, you're breaking the 2 guys' legs, you just work your way across and do the same thing to all 3 of them, and yet it didn't happen. I mean, that's just one of the prophecies that had to take place for, this everything to be fulfilled, right? So I believe God concealed, he deceived the devil a little bit, right? With Jesus, he was a secret weapon. I don't know.
Okay, good example. The last example I have here is Rahab the harlot. We've got about 5 minutes. We'll see how far we get. It's quite a reading. And this is a context late. Oh, okay. Gary, sorry. Go ahead.
A thought occurred to me. Maybe we should look at this through the eyes of the midwives. It'd be one thing for the government to try to tell a truck driver who has never worked with babies a day in his life, kill a baby. It would kill my conscience, and I would not do it. But imagine how much harder it would be on a midwife to tell a midwife that. Somebody who, you're not a midwife because it was forced on you. You're a midwife because you love babies, and that's what you've chosen to do with your. So that would put even harder hardship on them.
It would.
To tell them, murder the ones that you have sworn your life.
I don't think we would ever assume that because they deceived Pharaoh, and the words they said, I think we're pretty much agreement on that. They could still have refused to perform the service, which would have been acceptable to God, and not deceived him. That's the question. Should they have, and then that would probably get them killed, and would likely, Pharaoh would appoint some midwives that would kill the babies. Likely, that would have been the case. But, so yeah, that's the question about, not so much about whether they actually would have killed the babies, but whether they should have deceived the king in the process, and disobeyed him, by the way. Okay. Okay. Great, appreciate the discussion a lot. So if any more comments or questions, this is going to be, okay, we'll see how far we get here with Joshua, who's coming in, spying out the land of Canaan before they go in to take it over. This is quite a few years ahead of where we are. This is after the Exodus, after 40 years wandering in the wilderness after they come out of Egypt. And so sometime later that Joshua sends out spies to spy out the land, and he sends some of them to Jericho. And so in chapter 2, verse 1 of Joshua, now Joshua the son of Nun sent out two men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out the country." Then the woman took the two men and hid them. That's a deception. You got to realize it's a deception. You're going to hide somebody. You're not being honest with the king here. So she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from." That was a deception. We'll see in a minute. Verse 5. "And it happened as the gate was being shut," is what she's saying, "when it was dark, that the men went out." They're gone. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Out and out lie deception, right? Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. As soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. So they're chasing a ghost. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you." See, she already knew this. Verse 10. "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea." We're not there yet in our study, but we'll get there. "For when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven and heaven above and on earth beneath." I'm going to look at her faith here. "Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token." Notice how she calls this deception kindness. Interesting. Maybe means something, maybe not. "And spare, let's see, that you also show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token. Spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death." So the men answered her, "Our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you." Okay. We're going to see next week, because this time is up, what God thought about Rahab, the harlot, and what she did. So you got to come back. That's all I can say. Classes, we got 10 minutes until worship, and we'll look at some passages that doesn't necessarily convince us that her deception was right, But boy, if it wasn't, I don't know what else you could say. What else could she do to help the spies than to hide them? And you know, I don't know. Think about that this next week. What could she have done differently that would have avoided this deception in order to save Joshua's spies? Okay, thank you for your presence and your attention this morning. Go out this week and don't lie to anybody, okay? Unless what? Okay. No, thank you.